I prepared it. I painted many, many sheets. I actually became quite sick from how much spray painting I did. So I learned to really cover myself and use proper ventilation from after that. But unfortunately, I never actually got to go see the artwork. So I had to create a manual, step-by-step instructions of exactly how to install the piece and how to light it. Unfortunately, my artwork was not seen by anyone because of the COVID restrictions for indoor artworks. So one of the largest works I've ever made, one of the most ambitious works, I never got to see. No one else got to see it either. I've come to the point where I don't always want to just make something to store it in my studio. And I definitely don't want to make something to post on Instagram. I want this to be something that people experience in person. And there's not very many places that can host a large installation. It's kind of unfortunate, but it's a reality.
Welcome back to the Installation Art Podcast, the number one and only podcast about installation art and the people who work with it. This show is dedicated to discussing the unique joys and challenges of the medium and uncovering stories from behind the scenes. I am your host, Anastasia Parmson. My guest today is artist David Spriggs. Originally from Manchester and now based on Vancouver Island in Canada, David creates large-scale 3D installations that exist between 2 and 3 dimensions. His work explores the notions of perception and perspective, and he's known for pioneering a unique technique that layers transparencies to create a 3D painting effect. His installations have been exhibited at major biennales and institutions worldwide. Here's my today's guest, David Spriggs. Tell me, on a scale of 1 to 10, how weird are you?
I would say if 1 is not weird, I would probably say not weird. 1. I don't think of myself as weird.
Okay. Name someone who's had a significant impact on your work.
I guess my parents, to be honest, and my brothers. Since I was a kid, my parents have encouraged my art, and I remember learning linear perspective from my mom when I was quite young. So, and my brother, he's also an artist. Both of them are artists, so we encourage each other and talk a lot about art with each other.
Okay, well, we'll get back to that. What's your favorite beverage in the studio?
Just water or tea or coffee.
What kind of tea?
Black tea, usually. Orange pekoe, sometimes rooibos.
All right, well, let's get back to the meat of the story. You were saying that your family really influenced you as an artist. Tell me more. Tell me where you grew up and what was it like growing up?
I'm originally from England, so we moved to Canada when I was a teenager, when I was 14. In terms of making art, I've always thought of myself as an artist. I would be the artist in each school I went to, and I remember time when I was younger watching the other kids playing on the street outside, and I was inside drawing. So it's just something that I just love to do. And my parents saw that too. So my dad made me a kind of drawing table for me to work at. And my brother would do drawings on it all the time and just kept doing that. And as I got older, kept pushing myself and trying different things with different art forms. I've really tried like everything I could possibly try, even from painting old master paintings to painting abstracts. You know, it's sort of a challenge. And also by putting yourself in these mindsets and trying different things, you take yourself into places you wouldn't have thought of before.
Did you try that just on your own initiative or was it in an academic setting?
I've always done it, actually. When I was younger, I liked to draw cartoons, and it kind of evolved from there into more comic book graphic novels and to more realistic, like portraiture. I did oil painting scenes I tried landscape painting. I won an award when I was 18 for Arts Achievement, Immigrants of Distinction Award in Calgary. And from that, I actually bought a big rock, a sandstone rock, a huge 2-ton boulder, and had it delivered at my parents' home, and just bought some chisels when I went to Florence. And when I got home, I started just creating a stone sculpture. So yeah, really trying as many different forms as possible, even photography and filmmaking, and I guess more recently with digital art.
So you always kind of knew that you were an artist or were going to be an artist when you grew up.
I did. I do remember having the conversation with my parents about job potentials one day, and I wanted to be an artist, like no question. Everyone I spoke to said it's not a viable thing to do, but it's nice that I could prove them wrong a bit.
And did you study art? Did you go to university for that?
Yes, I studied at Emily Carr, the university in Vancouver, and I went on students' exchange to Central St. Martin's in London. I did want to have some time back in England just to put myself in a different mindset of making art. And then a number of years later, I took my master's degree at Concordia University in Montreal. And during that time, I also went on exchange to the Bauhaus University in Weimar to do a class on public art.
Wow, you've been around.
Yeah, I think it's important to get to know different places and different ways of thinking about how people think in the world. It's very easy to kind of fall into a bubble. And I think as an artist, it's important to take yourself out of your bubble now and then just to expand your art and your well-being as well.
How did you then turn to making installation type works? What led to that?
Well, coming from more of a painting background, I really started looking at art history of like the lineage of what's interesting about art. And I did find the exploration of space something quite fascinating. So various artists have obviously worked with space sculptors primarily, but there's a number of different painters that started exploring space. Even futurist art and cubist art and, the pictorial space kind of coming into real space. So as a painter, I thought, how could I bring painting into space? How could I capture pigment in space? We think of it more like virtual reality now. We can kind of, in a sense, paint in space, but to actually physically have something in space. And so I thought of many different ways to do it, but it started to become interesting to me to think of transparency as a method of holding pigment in space. I'd thought of threads of hanging, but I kind of quickly came to think about the most transparent thing I could think of, which was glass or plexiglass or transparent film. And by layering these sheets through space, it becomes its own environment. And so I realized very early on that if I were to paint in this kind of layered space, I could start to represent ideas, or I could represent forms or subjects in a way that hadn't ever been done before. The very, very first layered piece I made was back in 1999. And there's really nothing like it at the time. I think the closest thing I could find to this layered space was the cross-sectioning that was done for the Human Body Project, where they cross-sectioned a cadaver into many, many layers and separated this form in space. But I could see this kind of almost immaterial space as having potential to represent subjects in different ways that could create completely new engagement from the viewer on experience of a sort of sculpture, but it's still painting. I could do any two-dimensional media on the surface. It could be photography but I found that actually using an airbrush, which had no boundaries to the pigment, the pigment just kind of almost evaporated as it goes towards the edges of where there's no color. It was quite interesting. And it also allowed each layer to kind of blend into the layer behind. I could create this form in space that really only could exist with viewer interaction. So it's only like through the viewer walking around the artwork could you actually see it as being a three-dimensional object. So in a way that my work is two-dimensional, but because of the viewer interaction and walking around, it becomes three-dimensional. So I found there's some really interesting thoughts about this balance between two-dimension and three-dimension. Going back to this idea of using the airbrush for the pigment blending into this space, it adhered to the transparencies, and each layer blended into the next layer. And I would also paint very, very transparently. So you would actually be looking through simultaneously many layers of color. One of the first pieces, there was a piece called Perceptible Consciousness, which was a cloud-like form through about 70 sheets of transparent film that were hung within a display case, very precisely apart. So each sheet became a sort of cell. Like if you think of film being the viewers sit down to see moving images repeated in front of them. So that movements created by the flickering of one image being replaced by another. Here, each slice of a sheet becomes a sort of cell of a film. And so it's through the navigation of the viewer that you are kind of animating, giving this form three dimension. So it's kind of interesting to think of it in relation to cinema, but also painting and sculpture. I really, really found this, and I still find this technique and material very interesting to work with. And I think there's a lot of possibility with it. So in terms of like coming to installation, it started with these smaller pieces, tabletop or pedestals. And I also realized I could make this architectural size. The first opportunity was at the Sharjah Biennial in 2009. I was invited to make an installation. And so I made Axis of Power, this kind of cyclone-like form, also almost appears like a universe. It was really on the kind of a room scale. And that was the first time I really thought of my work as being installation.
How do you approach the connection between the work and the space that it occupies? Is it site-specific, or could you shift locations?
Whenever I first make an installation, I always consider the context of the place. I think for me, I'd like to somehow incorporate art history and history, or even architectural history of a space with the work. So Axis of Power was a piece I knew would be in Sharjah. It's a desert climate. And it's not just the context of the architecture for me that I find important. It's all the context of the time. So at the time, there was the financial crisis that was just happening. And Dubai was really a focus to the world. And there's a real sense of this kind of circling of the region, this kind of turmoil of things changing. So Axis of Power touched a little bit on that, this kind of cyclone form that gives a sense of uneasiness. And the room it was displayed in, it was in the Sharjah Art Museum, was actually part of the car park, which they transformed into a black box. So the room became kind of neutral. So it was really the viewer with the work. The architecture kind of became invisible. Whereas with other pieces, let's say like my artwork Vision 2, which I displayed at in Messham's, Wiltshire, that was a 13th century monastic barn that has enormous history to it. It's very, very close to Stonehenge. When I first displayed that, it was the equinox, the solstice. And so there's a beautiful relationship of this piece, which is for me about perception and seeing in the sun and this time of year, but also in the context of this barn near Stonehenge, there's the connection there with enormous history behind it, thousands of years of humans looking towards the sun in awe, and Stonehenge, as we know, has been laid out to coincide with the solar cycles and the solstice. So I thought that was nice. In fact, in the barn, he also had some ancient little carvings. They were there to ward off evil spirits, to protect the livestock in the barn. But these little carvings almost had an appearance of a sun, or very similar to the piece vision too. So for me, the piece could be shown somewhere else, absolutely. But when I first make it artwork, I really love to have the context and the time and all kind of integrated into the work.
So would you say that generally when you make something like a commissioned installation, you want to start by researching the space, seeing the space, and then you come up with the idea for the work?
Yeah, I think it's a bit like how a painter might look at a blank canvas and think what could be in this space. I think it's very difficult to preconceive of an idea. Another good example of that, where the context really informed the artwork, was my artwork Gold, which many of my artworks are about the symbolic nature of color, not just historically the nature of color or the symbolism of color, but how we actually see it today. Like, what are contemporary notions of these colors? So the piece Gold, which was actually just yellow in color, for me, I thought gold was quite a bit more interesting, related to finance. It relates to, again, the sun. It's like historically gold is just loaded with meaning. In the States, I think as Mark Twain talked about, the Gilded Age, this kind of time where things were gilded to kind of like hide the corruption underneath, the decay of American society. So I made this piece Gold, knowing it would be in Pittsburgh, and the center of Pittsburgh is known as the Golden Triangle. So this installation, which appears when you first look at it as an inverted golden triangle, you have all these ephemeral figures that are painted onto the surface that are again layered through the space. And as you go to the side, the whole thing kind of breaks apart. But the first view of this, I wanted to become almost like an icon. The same sense of like when you walk into a church, there's a certain focal point to the space. The other aspect of it, I also knew that would be the time of the inauguration of the former president with Trump. And the opening coincided with the inauguration. And a piece that's about finance, the subject matter had to be about finance too. So I actually took the pediment of the New York Stock Exchange and represented it in a similar fashion, but upside down. My choice of representing it upside down was, I thought about the pittura infamante, which means defaming portrait. During the Renaissance in Italy, if they wanted to talk about corrupt officials or politicians or people in power, they would actually paint them and then turn these paintings upside down and display them in the center squares. There's kind of a public humility. So I really like that idea of pittura infamante. So pulling all these different elements together, the context, the time it was being shown, various symbols that are associated with the color to kind of create a piece which, when viewers see it, I really want it to be open to interpretation.
So your pieces, actually, a lot of them are displayed in a way that, as you said, as the viewer moves, what they see radically changes. Because when you look at the edge, you just see these vertical lines. Essentially, the image disappears.
Yeah.
How do you see the audience? What role do they play in your work?
I mean, I think that the whole point of art is the audience. So it's manipulating how the audience see. It's to create experiences, to maybe make people think differently or think about things they haven't thought. The experience of my work, especially the large scale installations, when you first encounter it, when you first walk into the room, is people usually go silent. They stop talking. And I really try and create that kind of space which becomes contemplative. I do find with a lot of moving images that we see now and the bombardment of sound and this kind of bombarding of senses, it doesn't leave that space for contemplation. So for me, I want the work to function in the same sense of the Caspar David Friedrich painting, where this man in front of nature is like the human just witnessing something that's beyond them to really contemplate. So I do try and create this overpowering imagery, which I think is a sort of power in itself. Some of my works actually are about the movement around the piece. So as the viewer sees this form or this subject matter and they start walking, they start to see that it's a three-dimensional. And as they move, the force of perception just keeps pushing them forward around the work and to the side. And from the side view, the imagery breaks apart. It becomes an empty space. So this form that exists really only exists in the person's mind. In that sense, it's a bit like Gestalt theory, which, we have various elements of different things that come together in our mind, and that becomes the whole. So as the viewer goes to the side, this kind of form breaks apart and starts to reform again as you walk around it. So you'll notice that many of my artworks are also about the borderlines of forms, like a form in becoming or a form breaking apart, this kind of sense of the ephemeral, the sense of this kind of balance between what we think of solid and immaterial. And so, in a sense, the artwork is forcing them to constantly walk around it. Rarely do people sit and stand in one spot with my work. It's very rare. Like it does happen, but I feel like viewer interaction is pivotal to the work and also is kind of part of the meaning behind it.
Do you build everything yourself?
I do almost everything myself. Yeah. There's certain elements that I have to get people to work on for me. My works are almost consistently painting on transparency. I have done some artworks which are using metal more recently, layered metal, but I would actually paint by hand every piece, which, can be extremely time consuming.
What's the biggest number of layers you've had to do for one piece?
I believe that was my artwork called Stratochrome. That was 2010. I think it had 400 layers. That one actually really took the wind out of me.
No kidding. And you did all that on your own?
I actually had my brother helping me with that one. So we fortunately helped with some of the imagery. And one of the aspects of my work, when I'm painting it, I have to dry the paint. So standing there with a hairdryer trying to dry this paint so I could roll the sheet up in preparation for doing another sheet. I can't have all the sheets out at once because with spray paint, the pigments are in the air, so they would actually contaminate the next sheet. So I have to be very careful to do one sheet at a time and then package it away, usually one on top of another. And so my big installations can actually roll together very, very compactly so I can store them, which is, as an artist, you do have to figure out some logistics to things. Sometimes it doesn't always work to do things that are going to take up too much space.
Don't I know it?
I'd love to do artworks on glass more, but just the logistics of working with glass, once you start getting to a certain size, if you're working with a sheet of glass that's 20 foot high, it needs to be probably 3 centimeters deep or even more perhaps. And so then you need cranes and then the costs of shipping and, before long it's not looking very feasible to make. So I developed a way of making large scale installations that was feasible. It's still time consuming. It's a lot more work than maybe just projecting something. I'm not dismissing projection art out there, but a lot of people actually do think my artwork is projection, which kind of is annoying actually, because I feel like just thinking of it as a projection reduces it. You don't think three-dimensionally so much anymore. There's a lot of ways of thinking about the work. And it's kind of nice to think of it as a three-dimensional painting too.
So how long would such a project take you start to finish, the 400 sheets?
I'd say that the bulk of my time is actually thinking about a project. I actually spend a lot of time thinking from various viewpoints of, let's say, if an art historian were to be seeing this work, what would they say? Which artists would they relate the artwork to? How would they see it in terms of art history, as a lineage of art history? Is it interesting in those ways? So I would be thinking about how to change the artwork to perhaps make that more interesting. And then there's the time of sketches and working out the imagery. So something like Stratochrome, I had a lot of different subjects within the artwork. But yeah, each step can take a long time. Some projects I would be working on while I'm working on another project just to kind of break the time up a bit. But it could take as much as like from 2 months to 8 months, depending on the project. Realistically, though, these large installations, I only would do maximum one every year, year and a half.
So most of the time you use flexible sheets for your work, is that correct?
Well, for the transparent works, I've used glass, I've used plexiglass, and I've used transparent film. For the large scale installations, I only use transparent film. I would love to hopefully be able to do some public artworks in the future using large scale architectural glass. That's kind of what I'd really like, to really work with these massive sheets of glass that you see in skyscrapers and start layering that, maybe a public square. I think there'd be some really interesting things to do there. The large scale installations, I've used the transparencies just for logistics and being able to use so many sheets, the very, very, very thin sheets. And I also think about with the layering process of how many sheets I can see through, because it does become more opaque as you look through the sheets. It's not true transparency. So maybe I can see through that 30, 35 sheets. So I plan an artwork on how deep I want the viewer to see. And then some of my other works, I've done small glass ones with etching on glass. And then I also work with plexiglass instead of glass, just for the weight issues. And so I've done some fairly large pieces with plexiglass. Plexiglass again, has its limitations. And so this is hard to find methods to, really work on a bigger scale, work with building something that really feels totally transparent. And then I've also been working on some metal layered pieces, which are different types of work for different, I usually think about the concept and then I choose the material and how I want to, which way I should go with it.
How did those first opportunities to show the larger scale installations come about for you?
Just from invitations, different places, yeah. Sometimes, approach different places, but it's usually by invitation. People see one of my works and then invite me to do something.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's quite hard for artists, actually, especially starting out when you've maybe not got a huge background. And
Yeah.
I think it's going to actually be even harder with AI to actually be seen online. And for installation artists, it's so easy to, come up with concepts which appear like it's been made, but it hasn't. And so I think, there's going to be a time before AI and time on.
Well, at the moment, even just getting seen on social media is a major struggle. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
What happens to the work after an exhibition ends?
It's usually prepared so I can exhibit it again, or sometimes sold, sometimes, I just store it. So it depends for each piece and the situation.
So the larger ones, you can roll them up and store them fairly easily.
That's right, yeah.
Okay. Hey, this is a quick intermission to let you know that this show is also on YouTube, where you can see the artist's facial expressions and maybe even some images of their work. If you're loving this episode so far, share it with a friend who might also enjoy it. I'll let you get back to the story. Do you have any behind-the-scenes stories of some unexpected issues you've had to face during installation or exhibition process?
Oh, I've got a million stories. I'm sure every artist does. But some of the projects I've worked on have really taken me to some amazing places. I think that's maybe the great thing about being an artist and really meeting all different types of people in the world. I mentioned Sharjah before. The team of people that were there to help me install, they didn't speak any English, so I really learned a little bit about their culture. We know what they ate. So each project is full of its own stories. I'd have to choose one of the pieces to maybe talk about and maybe give you a story behind it. Let me think. There's just so many. So my artwork of the red wave piece, First Wave, I think that's maybe an interesting story. So I was approached by the committee to do an installation for the Okinoto Triennial in Japan, in Suzu. It's the place right by the coast, beautiful place, and it's kind of a small village kind of sense to it with their own traditions and history. So they took me to various sites, different warehouse spaces, kind of gallery-like spaces, really all different places like theaters. But what was interesting to me was this massive fishing net warehouse. It had all these ropes on the ground from these huge fishing nets, and you really had this sense of this kind of history of this place, which now is just there. I don't think it's used for fishing nets anymore, but, you had this kind of connection to the ocean, and just outside, you could see the ocean not far away. So I thought about what would be interesting to do for this piece, but this is also at the very, very beginning of COVID. It was this sense of like something bad is going to happen. There's kind of a fear. And I flew back to Canada and started thinking about what to do with this fishing net warehouse, this enormous space. And I thought about waves, about the beautiful history of Japanese art. And the wave is so important to so many artworks. The Great Wave by Hokusai. That piece, I think, perhaps was the most inspirational because that represented a time of when Japan was actually separating itself from the rest of the world. And as the COVID restrictions started to come into place, again, Japan was separating itself and the world was separating itself. And so I liked the idea of this kind of wave as the kind of sense of impending destruction, but this moment, the kind of freeze frame moment, like the Great Wave in the Hokusai print, which is kind of frozen in time. And as the time went on, the media kept talking about waves of COVID. There's the first wave and second wave. And so the triennial was actually postponed for a year. So I had a bit more time to think about it and make the artwork. But as the time went on, I realized that I wanted to do like a tsunami wave through the space in this layered technique I've developed. Having this kind of epic scene unfolding in front of you. And I actually decided to change the color from white, which I was originally going to do, to red, this blood red that really, really connects with the body. And I'm aware of the kind of the physical reaction to my work. This is the perceptual, but it's also a very physical thing because as a viewer, we're very tactile, and so then here in front of us is something very ephemeral. It's a sculpture, but it doesn't exist in like the sense of a traditional marble sculpture. And much of the history of sculpture has been very definite edge. And so I thought by changing this artwork to be red, it would create this sense that the color also bled into the space, the light reflecting off all the pigment would, reflect on your body, or it'd become part of the environment. You're almost immersed in this kind of objectification of color through space. And so I prepared it, and I painted many, many sheets. I actually became quite sick from how much spray painting I did. So I learned to really cover myself and use proper ventilation from after that. But having that time of COVID, this kind of time of anxiety and turbulence, this piece really related to that. And unfortunately, I never actually got to go see the artwork. So I had to create a manual, step-by-step instructions of exactly how to install the piece and how to light it. And, and the intended reaction for the viewer, it's very, very, very technical. While my work is very technical, I like to have that sense that it's not so technical. The imagery becomes very fluid. It feels like it doesn't feel technical when you see the work. And so the opening happened for the triennial, and unfortunately, my artwork was not seen by anyone because of the COVID restrictions for indoor artworks. And so no one saw my artwork. And then a number of weeks later, they opened briefly for maybe a week that people could see it. I'm not sure if anyone actually saw it. So one of the largest works I've ever made, one of the most ambitious works, I never got to see. No one else got to see it either. So
After all that, did the remote installation with your directions at least go smoothly, and did they get it right?
Oh yeah, it looked perfect. It's really what I had imagined. And yeah, they were really, really good about making this perfect. And they even had many photos they were sending back to me to just check if it's exactly what I wanted. And it's one of those pieces that I think I would love to show it again, in the right context. I much, much prefer, it's not always possible to show it at museums. What I really love about museums or art galleries is when people approach an artwork, they're looking at it critically. They're thinking about it. Whereas if you display it in festivals, for example, there's more a sense of artwork as a sort of entertainment, something to just absorb and see something else. But for me, the Triennial was an important exhibition, and I did like that context. And so again, for me, like the context of the time was also important for the work. So if it was shown again, the title of the work is First Wave, but whether people would relate to it in the same way, because this was being shown when the worst of COVID was happening, before the vaccinations, and it was really a different time. And so I think it will mean something a little bit different, showing it in a different context. Yeah.
Yeah, well, maybe you can show it somewhere that was affected by actual bad weather.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, recently, Suzu experienced a massive earthquake, which was very unfortunate. And much of Suzu had major damage. And, creating a piece that, this kind of sense of impending destruction, that feels very different. I think if I were to display it there now, it would maybe relate more to the earthquake. Or so I do think it's always important, the context and the time for any artwork.
What about the longevity? Are you preoccupied with making your work, so to speak, archival quality?
I think it's important. Artists always try to do that, unless they're deliberately making artwork to just be discarded. But, I'm using plastic. I don't want to waste it. I do consider myself an environmentalist, and when I use material, I treat it like it's like gold, something to be really looked after. So all of my installations, I make sure that they're carefully packaged again so that they can be seen again. And I almost have no waste when I make a piece too. So there's maybe possibly one garbage bag for an installation, but it's it's really important, the materials. And I often reuse the frameworks for some of my installations so that those are repurposed. And I use springs that I reuse as well for the large installations. So
Springs? What are springs used for in your work?
So the tension created to create a nice, even plane. I think of my work as like a kind of cross-sectioning of space. And so I think of each plane as like a cross-section. And to keep that as straight and as perfect as possible at the corners of the sheets, I use springs to compensate if there's any wind or movement in the space so that the sheets don't rip, or so that they have a sort of suspension system.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's very elaborate. So you've been working in this style or this technique since basically 1999. That's quite a while. And this is a bit of a personal question for me because this is conversations I've had with my artist friends recently. Do you ever think, oh, I just want to do something totally different? I can't do this anymore.
Well, I think making one of my works, like, can be daunting, but I've got some really, really good ideas. I just need the right moment to kind of reveal them.
Mm-hmm.
I've come to the point where I don't always want to just make something to store it in my studio.
I know.
I definitely don't want to make something to post on Instagram. I want this to be something that people experience in person. And there's not very many places that can host a large installation. A lot of places, they may have just bought a new projector and they want to just send a digital file through the mail. And my work is material based. So it's one of the things that unfortunately has actually worked against me too. Like, there's been 2 major galleries that have pulled out of showing my work because they didn't want to pay for the shipping. It's kind of unfortunate, but it's a reality.
Yeah, I know. For me, it's like living in Australia, the middle of nowhere, butthole of the world. Shipping large scale heavy stuff anywhere outside of this continent is like nobody wants to do that.
No. And I mean, if a gallery or museum could host an artist that maybe is a great artist, that doesn't cost them anything there's no investment besides maybe some marketing, I think it's easier for them. I do think of my work as really like a material-based practice.
Yeah, your work really does need to be experienced at least via video, but more in person.
Yeah, I don't actually really like a video of my work because I think what you can't really experience is the scale of it. For me, scale is quite important. When you walk into the room and you see maybe a familiar place like you've been to before, a gallery you maybe seen before, and then you see quite a monumental scale work, it has kind of a presence that you may not experience in a video. Some of my works are about 22 foot high, like 5 meters so high. The other artworks I've done are the largest ones, Stratochrome, the green one, was 55 foot wide. So that's like quite really, like, when you see something that big in the space, it's quite a different experience. And like if you're at the cinema or something, you don't always think of how big a screen is, but I think when it becomes more sculptural, something that exists in your own space as like form in space, it becomes quite monumental. And I think historically also scale gives prestige to the artwork. Let's say in the past, the painters would do a monumental scale painting. It would cost a lot, and the only people that could afford that might be the royalty. And so large scale becomes more important. I don't think it's quite the same now because there's so many artists have worked on enormous, enormous scales that are just kind of absurd. I do find a lot of art that's made extremely wasteful, actually. You can see it's maybe temporary, but for scale, I've actually worked with it quite a bit to either create an intimacy, like with the small works, or kind of a sense of power for the large works. So axis of power is kind of cyclone-like form. You're faced with it, on a monumental scale, you're faced with it. I have the eye of a storm above someone's head. So there's a certain power relationship. So it's something greater than them. Whereas on a small scale, there's an intimacy. It becomes more object-based, it becomes something, an intimate feeling. Other works like Gravity is very similar to the artwork Vision, but it's kind of spiraling round. I wanted that to be big too, because it's one of the other elements that I'm interested in, science. And the idea of gravity, and I was thinking, if it had form, what could this form be? How would you represent gravity? So you have this kind of concave space with these almost force lines rotating around this pivot point. But what I was actually surprised about, so I've made these kind of works for many years, and then the pictures of black holes came out, the photos. And I was quite surprised how similar these works were to the actual black holes. And it's like quite striking to have that connection. It's thinking of macro and micro. It's quite interesting.
Actually, I want to go back to something you said earlier about the scale, that some of the pieces were like 5 meters tall and whatnot. What does your studio look like? How do you fit that in? Do you paint on the floor?
Well, if you notice, most of my artworks are kind of divided into sections. And so one section I would actually paint sideways. So the sheets that are for the large scale pieces are usually about 5 foot wide. And so I can take the roll as far wide on the wall as I want. I actually have a massive studio too, so I'm able to do that. But in the past, I would even paint part of an image, because I didn't always have a big studio. And so, if my studio was 10 foot wide, the wall, I would actually have 2 roller systems on either side of the sheet. And I'd paint maybe half of an image, and then I'd try it, roll it to the one roller, and then paint the other half. So just a bit of the image at a time, and using a sort of topography to get a sense of where I need to paint. Sometimes I would use digital methods to do that. So I say like a sphere, it's very hard to work out how to represent a sphere through layers, through space. And so I, on the computer, just create a sphere. It's like one of the easiest things you can do in 3D. And I'd create a geometry of, it cross-sectioned that sphere. And I'd use that as a template, just that single line to be where I would use to paint. So it's very, very, the painting process is still very like a handmade thing, but I'm using the topography to get forms correct through space. I actually do find it kind of nice to see the hand of artists in a work. I do love digital art. There's some amazing stuff happening. But at the same time, I've really got an affinity to painting. I love to see brushstrokes. Like when I go into a museum, I love to see these artists of the past, how they represented space, how they use color to manipulate our emotions and to communicate stories. But to see the hand of the artist is nice. And I think as a viewer, we relate more to it. Digital work is primarily using projection or monitors, screens. My brother actually is a digital artist, so I know it can be like a true art form. But yeah, I still love to see the hand of the artist. So with all my works, I feel like there's a certain connection. I feel it, and I hope that other people feel it too.
Have you ever collaborated with your brother and made something that's like a hybrid?
Well, he always helps me with the digital stuff, so many times, yeah. A lot of the figurative elements in my work, he's been a big hand in helping me with that. And yeah, in terms of a proper collaboration, we usually keep our artwork separate. We have different ways of thinking about things. My brother, for people that don't know his work, he became quite well known for doing 3D portraits at a time when 3D modeling of people was mostly for the film industry. He would actually do these kind of hyperreal portraits, and some of the portraits he did are actually some of the most hyperreal portraits you can do with digital software. And he would painstakingly, pore by pore, be modeling and creating these 3D versions of people. He's actually worked with some very famous people in the film industry, which he also works for. But yeah, his portraits were quite groundbreaking. And, we often discuss this kind of like what digital is, how is it art, how is portraits, like, how does it differ from sculpture? And we talk about my work too, and there's a lot of dialogue there.
Well, give him a shout out. What's your brother's name?
As Ian Spriggs.
Okay.
Yeah.
How about collaborating with other artists? Have you ever dipped your toes into that?
I've never done that. To be honest, I just recall when I would be at school, when teachers would put me with other students and would have to make an art project together, and how infuriating it was. So,
are you still traumatized by that?
I think most artists are, a bit strong-headed how they want to do something. So if I were to do some sort of collaboration with someone, it would really have to work for both vision, because I usually have a very specific vision to what I want to do. If people, let's say gallerists, suggest what I should do, I never do it.
That's a bit of a red flag, really, for me. If somebody suggests, I've had that happen. I'm like, what did you say?
I think it happens a lot, actually. And I urge artists out there to always do what they want. I honestly don't feel our lives are very long to really produce and show your mark as an artist. So it's important to, be truthful to yourself.
Yeah, for sure. Can you tell me about the role of the lighting in your work?
Yeah, well, I think of more transparency than light. Light is a tool to just illuminate. So for me, where I make marks on the surface, those are places that I want to highlight. I want it to stand out. If you imagine you're working through a transparent space and you want to have something illuminated, so that's where you make the mark. So I'm really thinking about illumination. Whereas when I use the color black, I really want to actually make my next installation on the color black. So black is like the antithesis to light in a way. You could only see it as silhouette. So I would illuminate the wall behind the artwork, not the artwork. So if it's color or white, they're places I want to illuminate. And so I usually like to have the rest of the room a little bit darkened so that there's a kind of a focal point to the artwork, as if the artwork's creating its own light. I try and hide the lights as much as I possibly can, because I really want it to just be about the pigment through space. Whereas the black artworks, I have to illuminate a white wall behind. So my next piece, I really want it to be about kind of an antithesis to vision, like the opposite, which we think of blindness, but it's still seeing. So I wouldn't position myself as a light and a space artist. I think there's something else going on, and hopefully one day people can slot me into the right category. But I think there's something else going on here. It's not just about light. And for me, that's transparency. I think of my medium is transparency. So working with opacity, working with lights and darks. Transparency is also interesting, not just thinking of it as a medium, but also thinking of the metaphor of transparency. Like when we think of surveillance or issues around privacy, we think of transparency as being a sort of an openness. So transparency being, open and democratic. And so there's a huge wealth of ideas that can be associated to transparency there. But now I'm actually thinking more about transparency as more in terms of a blindness, because, if you have a full openness to everything where, let's say, all data is revealed, everything is transparent, it's an overload of information that becomes a sort of blindness. You're oversaturated. There's so much information that you don't know how to deal with anything. So I think it's interesting to think of, transparency as a material quality, as a perceptual quality, and a metaphorical quality.
Now, if time, geography, budget, everything else were not a consideration, what would be your dream project to make?
Well, I have a few projects. Like I really want to do this installation on black. I think that would be quite groundbreaking because what I have in mind is quite elaborate. It would require an enormous space with various elements to the artwork, not just a kind of a single installation, but numerous installations within one space, all work with a color black. So there will be a relationship between them all, but at the same time, kind of separate elements. That would be my kind of ideal project. But I also would really like to, as I mentioned earlier, to do some public artworks. I actually did some plans to do some public artworks in the past. Unfortunately, none of them have actually been realized. I think maybe the committees were scared of the idea of something in glass. Even though architectural glass can be bulletproof and they use it for bank windows so people can't drive through it, but there's still this idea of glass being fragile. So, taking these large sheets and doing something in the center of a square somewhere, I'd like to create that dialogue with traditional sculpture. When we think of marble sculpture, is as a very solid thing, but then here's a sculpture of the immaterial, but something that's very still. Another aspect I didn't mention with my work is a lot of my work, I represent motion. Like I want to create this sense of movement, but the work is so still. And many, many times, there's calls for proposals and I hear that they want movement in the artwork. And for me, that just comes back to they just want a projection or something like that,
Well, there is movement in your artwork in that, if nothing else, it really forces the viewer to move around it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I agree. There's definitely movement. One point I didn't really discuss was how the colors, how it's about our time. I have an artwork called Black and White, which I made for Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. The title, Black and White, for me is more about the psychology of black and white. And it, for me, is really about our time. There's a sense in politics and there's a sense in the world that everything's becoming this or that as them. There's a separation of thinking, which in psychology is black and white thinking. When I was thinking about this symbolism of the colors black and white, I realized that you can't really have black without white. So for me, they were really tied together. And being in Saudi Arabia, I was very also concerned about the cultural ideas of these two colors. So I had to be respectful. And I also wanted the work to create some discussion too. So I came up with the idea of just doing these orbs of color. I think that was for me already a sort of a statement. The viewer can actually walk between and around them and see parts where they overlap together. With the black and white, there's just so many cliches and symbols that traditionally people have used, like yin and yang, or maybe talk about race. is so loaded. It's very, very, very difficult to make an artwork that is saying something new or not becoming a cliche. I think it worked out quite well. But when I showed it in Noriad, their paperwork actually flagged this work as being controversial. Which, as much as I didn't think it would be, it still had a flag next to it as controversial. So,
wow.
I take it as a badge of honor, though.
I'm very sorry. There's a fire in the building upstairs. We evacuate.
Did you hear that? Sorry, I have to go.
Okay. Well, lovely to talk to you, and look after yourself. Okay.
Thank. Well, that took a turn, an unexpected turn of events here at this recording studio where there was an actual fire and we had to evacuate for hours and hours. So yes, unfortunately, this interview got cut dramatically short. But I'd say, luckily, we covered pretty much most of the topics I was going to ask David anyway. As far as I know, everyone's okay. There were no casualties, but it was a bit of a situation in the middle of the city in Sydney. So, yeah, that's life. It is what it is, like Edith Carlson taught us in episode 17. So that was David Spriggs, based on Vancouver Island. And you can go and see all the works he was talking about in this interview on his website, davidspriggs.art. That's DAVIDSPRIGGS.art. And if you feel like there were some questions left for you, why don't you go and DM him, follow him on Instagram and ask him. His Instagram is @David_Spriggs. Links to those and everyone mentioned in this episode will, as always, be in the show notes and on our website, installationartpodcast.com. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to hit that subscribe button wherever you're listening. Subscribing helps us grow and gain visibility, and it ensures you won't miss new episodes. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time.